Good morning, everyone. It's great to be with you. I think, there's a picture on the screen of my wife and my son. Somebody was asking me about that. And the graffiti on there was put on there by my son. So I was very happy to leave that up there. And so it's a favourite picture of mine. But that's my wife and my son. I said before, I'm very excited to be here, not only for this weekend, but for the forthcoming programs. And I know Ashley has already mentioned it before, but 7:15 on Friday is when these programs begin. And I've been thrilled to hear about the level of activity that people around Kingscliff have been involved in to prepare for this program. It was great to hear from some of the students who've been going door to door and hearing of their experiences. I want to share with you today my personal journey. And just turn in your Bibles to Revelation chapter 12, just by way of introduction. Revelation chapter 12, and I'm going to read from verses 10 and 11. And it says, "Then I heard a loud voice saying in heaven, 'Now salvation and strength and the kingdom of our God and the power of his Christ have come. For the accuser of our brethren, who accused them before our God day and night, has been cast down. And they overcame him by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony. And they did not love their lives to the death.'" And it's that verse 11 where it says, they overcame him by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony. And what I'm going to share today is part of my testimony, the testimony about what the Lamb has done for me, about what the blood of the Lamb has done for me and what it means to me. I was not brought up in a Christian home. My mother was kind of a once-a-month Anglican. She might go to church once a month, but she never talked about the Bible. We never read the Bible in our homes. We never prayed. We only mentioned God's name in vain. My father was basically an agnostic. My brother was an agnostic, and I was an agnostic. And I was born and raised in Birmingham, England. And that's about where Birmingham is. And there was my mother, my father, my brother and I, the four of us there, living in a typically secular English home. When I was growing up, I believed in evolution. I was a very firm believer in evolution, particularly through my schooling. And I thought, if God exists, I don't really want to know him, because I'd bought into the myths and the common assumptions about God, that God was kind of this person who was permanently angry with us, and particularly if you'd done something wrong. And I figured I'd probably done a number of things wrong, so God must be angry with me. And I'd also bought into that lie that if God exists, he was the kind of person who will burn you in hell forever if you don't love him. And I didn't think that was a very attractive picture of God. And so I rejected God, and I determined that if he did exist, he didn't care about me and I wouldn't care about him. And maybe he didn't exist anyway after all. And so that was me growing up. And growing up in Birmingham, England, I guess as I grew into my teenage years, I became interested in the typical things that English males are interested in, which is beer, TV and football. And I did a lot of that. This is my house. I was actually born in this house. Most people were born in a hospital, but I was born in the house that my mother still lives in, and I can go visit the place. In fact, this is the back of the house, and the large window at the top, that's the room I was born in. It's now my brother's bedroom, and my brother, who's 48 and an accountant, still lives at home. And so when I go home, I go into the house and I go into the room and I tell him to clean up the room. This is where I was born. So my brother still lives at home. And I guess Birmingham, where the town, let me tell you a little bit about the town where I came from. Birmingham, England's probably famous for a couple of things. Number one, Cadbury's. Cadbury's originated in Birmingham, England. So half my family worked for Cadbury's, and the other half of the family worked for Austin Rover car manufacturers, where they built minis. And I actually, at one time, I used to be an assembly line operator for Austin Rover. I used to put petrol tanks in minis, 200 a day. And there was another guy doing the same, so there was about 400 minis rolling off the assembly line at any given day. And that was back in 1987. So when I left school, I started out life as a mechanic, and then after about 3 or 4 years of that, I was working at the factory making cars. When I was 14, yeah, don't you love that kid? He actually looks a lot like my son. If you take away the hair, he looks a lot like my son did last year when he was 14. But when I was 14, a friend introduced me to drinking and smoking. When I was 19, I started using marijuana. And when I was 14, I remember thinking about my grandparents. My grandparents were getting older. And I was thinking, you know, my grandparents are going to grow old and they're going to die one day soon. And I wonder what happens to them, because being a believer in evolution, I believed in a material universe. And so there was nothing after that. And I thought, well, they're going to die and that will be the end of them. And then my parents will get old and they will die and that'll be the end of them. And then I'm going to get old and I'm going to die and that'll be the end of me. What's the point? What's the point? And I thought for the first time about the logic of suicide. I don't actually think that I ever planned to commit suicide, but I thought of the logic of suicide. If life wasn't very pleasant and there was nothing else after this, why continue to go through the battle? Why continue to go on the journey if there's nothing else? And I started to struggle with these concepts of what was the meaning of life? What was the purpose? Was there any reason for me to be here? This was a picture of me at 19, and I was very much a follower. I would do things that my friends did. So if my friends got earrings, I would get an earring. If my friends dyed their hair, I would dye my hair. I was just a follower of the crowd. Quite a shy individual. If you don't believe in miracles, me talking to a group of people is a miracle for a start. That's a miracle of God, because I would not ever have thought that that would happen to me. And so that was me at 19. So after I was working at the car factory, I did that for about 6 months, and then some friends of mine had started working in Birmingham in a restaurant, and it was an American restaurant. And in this American restaurant, they had this big square bar in the middle. If you've ever seen the TV show Cheers, it's kind of a bar like that. And it was exciting. They said, you should come and work here. So I got a job there, and I started working as a cocktail bartender. This is actually not in the restaurant. This was in a festival we did in Germany. But I'm working in the middle of Birmingham in an American-themed cocktail bar restaurant, okay? And as a cocktail bartender, you had to learn how to be able to spin bottles and things. And so I would spend a lot of time learning how to juggle and juggling bottles for people. Get there. So I'd spend a lot of my time doing that, you see. And while I was there, a friend, another guy who was working there said, you know, we're opening this bar in Cyprus, why don't you come over there? So I went to Cyprus for a few weeks. Didn't last very long because I ended up not getting a work permit and they were going to threaten to throw us out the country, so I ended up coming back to Birmingham. But after about a year of working as a cocktail bartender in this American-styled cocktail bar in Birmingham, a guy came to work at the bar. At that particular... No, it wasn't Tom. It wasn't Tom. At about the same time, Hollywood launched this movie called Cocktail. And Tom Cruise and Brian Brown, the two actors in it, they were trained by the company for which I worked. And so in the film, the first bar they go into is the same company that we worked for. And so we had a lot to do with promoting the film. And this other guy who came to work there, his name was, that's me, but this is Steve. His name was Steve. Steve comes to work at the bar about this time. I didn't think anything unusual about Steve. We were working, doing the same thing. We both were asked to go on television and do some juggling to promote the film Cocktail, and we used to do nightclub promotions and things like that. But Steve was working with me in the service bar one day where the waitresses come to get their drinks. And they put their orders in, and they've got little register numbers on these orders, a bit like invoices and stuff. And it had the number 666 on the invoice. And Steve turns to me, he says, that's in the Bible, don't you? And I look at him and say, leave me alone. He says, that's in the Bible. Do you know what it means? I said, no, I don't, and I'm not interested. What a creepy kind of question to ask somebody. It turns out that Steve had been raised Seventh-day Adventist. He was now working as a cocktail bartender. He was doing the same job as I was doing. He lived in the same town, had the same lifestyle as me. But until he was 13, he was raised Seventh-day Adventist. His parents had had some argument with the church and had fallen out of the church or had left the church, and Steve was unable to go from the age of 13 onwards. So he ceased to go, and he'd sort of drifted into the world. But it's amazing what you remember from kindergarten Sabbath school and other Sabbath schools, I'm sure. But Steve started to share things. Well, anyway, while we were at the bar, he and I were studying for a master bartender certificate. We were studying to be master bartenders, and I don't know what to tell you about this. We had to learn 400 different cocktails by memory, and you do tests on them. And it was a strange sort of environment. But anyway, I would go to his house and study with him, and he would come to my house. And whenever we'd go to his house, he would pull out one of these. This is called the Pictorial Aid to Bible Study, and you can buy them at the ABC. And I, of course, never heard or seen one of these before. And they're full of pictures and charts that help to illustrate Bible teachings. And Steve would pull out this and say, I want you to have a look at this. And I'm looking at that and thinking four-headed leopards and statues, and I have no idea what that's about. Completely over my head. But on the inside cover, it had an address. And it said, printed at Science Publishing Company, Warburton, Victoria, Australia. And that captured my attention. I just focused on the address and I thought, why has this guy in Birmingham, England got a folder that's printed in Australia? Nothing in Europe is printed in Australia, you understand. And so I'm thinking, how come this guy has got this folder? Well, we would continue studying, and whenever we were at his house, he would pull this out and show me a few things, and I'd say, yeah, okay, pass the time. Anyway, to cut a long story short, both he and I left the bar work and did other things, but we remained firm friends. We would go out together. And one day I was at his house. I'd left the bar work and I started working as a sales rep for a glass processing company. And Steve began working as a driving instructor of all things. But anyway, I was around his house, I think it was a Sunday afternoon. And again, he was showing me something from the Bible. And by this time, we'd become good friends. And I was giving him the time of day. I wasn't really interested, but I was willing to put up with him. And so, tell me what you want to tell me. And he was talking about the flood and all of the evidence there is for Noah's flood in the earth. And he talked about how the ark came to rest on Mount Ararat and how Noah came out and he offered sacrifices on the altar and how God put a rainbow in the sky as a promise to Noah and the human family that God would never flood the world again as he did during the time of Noah. And I thought, that's interesting, I said. I didn't know the Bible said anything about rainbows. I didn't know anything at all about the Bible. And so that came to an end that afternoon. I went home. The next day, driving to work on the road, busy road in Birmingham, the rain was falling, my wipers were going, and there over the middle of the road was the brightest, most beautiful rainbow I've ever seen. And at that moment, God spoke to my heart. And I burst into tears. I didn't even know why I was bursting into tears at first. I started crying. I pulled over to the side of the road. I remember picking up the phone and saying to Steve, Steve, did you see the rainbow? Did you see the rainbow? He was miles away, so he didn't see it. But two things struck me that day. Number one, there really was a God. And number two, what kind of a God puts a rainbow in the sky that everybody can see, but it's for one person? And that really gave me the creeps, because I thought, what is this saying about God that he would do that to get my attention? And so then I would connect with Steve and we would talk some more. And I was now interested in what he had to share from the Bible. And he showed me Daniel chapter 2, and I think it was probably about 3 times he must have gone over that. And we started watching Kenneth Cox videos back in the late 80s. And finally it clicked and I understood Daniel chapter 2, and I said, that's amazing. I can't believe that. God knows the future. It hadn't occurred to me before. But God knew the future, and the prophecies of Daniel and Revelation really inspired me. I have one son, his name's Daniel John, and he's named after the authors of Daniel and Revelation. Because those were 2 immense books that God led me to believe in him through those books. So he shared Daniel chapter 2 with me, and I was amazed by that. And then he shared the Sabbath with me, and I was blown away by the Sabbath. I mean, it must have been about a half hour to an hour that we studied the Bible, and then I understood the Sabbath, and I just couldn't understand how it was possible that the whole Christian world had missed this. I couldn't understand how in 1 hour somebody as biblically illiterate as myself could discover the Sabbath and understand it. And it was like this giant secret that nobody else knew. And suddenly I understood about the Sabbath because it was written right there. So I was blown away by the Sabbath. And then he shared with me the state of the dead, and I was blown away by that because that made perfect sense. I believe that when you die, nothing else. Now, of course, we believe that Jesus is coming and there'll be a resurrection. But it made sense to me that I couldn't talk to the dead right now because my grandparents had died at this point. And I would dearly love to communicate with my grandparents, but I can't because you know why? They're dead. They're sleeping. And so that made perfect sense to me. And he shared the truth from the Bible about the truth about hell. And that God is not going to burn the lost forever and ever and torture them. And that made an incredible impact on me in determining what kind of character God has. And so I was absolutely amazed by this stuff. So we were studying together, and it wasn't only me. You see, Steve and I, we worked at that bar, and there was a girl that came to the bar that Steve picked up. She became his wife, and she was studying too. There was another waitress at the restaurant. She began studying with us too, and there was like the 4 of us. And then Steve says, I know a pastor somewhere. I'm going to invite him to come study with us. So we were studying this little home group at Steve's house. And we would study for a little while. And then Steve said to me one day, he said, I know the truth. I'm going back to church. And I said, okay, I'll come with you. So Steve's first day back at church was my first day at church. This wouldn't have been the first day, but that's us outside the little church in Worcester in England. Tiny little Seventh-day Adventist church in the shadow of the massive cathedral. Go visit there sometime. So I went in. It's my first day ever at this church. And it's a tiny building. It's very plain inside. There are about 20 people there. They don't have any musicians, so they're singing a cappella from the old hymn book. There wasn't anything external that was exciting me or attracting me about this group of people or about this church. We sat down for Sabbath school, and I was, completely silent, just listening to the different points of view. And by the way, Sabbath school is still my favourite part of church. I love hearing the discussion and turning up the scriptures and being able to make a contribution. So it's the whole small group thing. So I love Sabbath school, but we're in this Sabbath school. I tell you, the teacher of the Sabbath school, he looked like Moses. He had this long grey hair and this long bushy beard, and he was teaching the lesson, and I was thinking, is this one of the prophets? And then there was a guy at the back who used to keep putting his hand up and say, well, Sister White says, and Sister White says this, and I need to tell you that right now, I am a firm believer in the spirit of prophecy. I greatly appreciate the spirit of prophecy. But back then I had no idea, and I actually thought that Sister White was a member who was away that week. Sister White says, I'm thinking, man, next week if Sister White's back, she must be impressive. So I had no idea who Sister White was. And then, so the church service, it was all very nice. And then we went to lunch. And lunch was they had this round table, and it was a very meagre lunch. You know, nothing spectacular on the table. But they had this small side plate, and they had these round grey slabs of something, which I've since learned is nuttolene. And I said, what's that? I mean, how many fruits and vegetables did that look like? Anyway. So I was sort of experiencing a few different things. But it was fascinating. I continued to go to the church with Steve for two reasons. Number one, the people were friendly. And number two, they taught the truth. Those were the two things that ultimately kept me going back to that church. The people were friendly and they taught the truth. And that's what I was interested in. The things I was learning in the Bible, I was amazed at. I had no idea what was in the Bible, really. I had this preconceived Western idea of what the Bible's all about, but I really had no idea what was in there. And so we were learning all this stuff. Now, I was kind of intellectually interested. I believed, but I was not really ready to give my heart to God. And so in England, I had a season ticket holder. I was a season ticket holder for a football club, Aston Villa Football Club. And I would go to them, you know, every home game that they had, and they played at home every Saturday, every fortnight. And so I would go to church one week when Villa were playing away, and then when they were at home, I would go to the football. You see, so my allegiance wasn't where it should have been. Around this time, a couple of guys who I used to work with, a couple of bartenders, they'd been to Australia for a year. And they came back to England, and I met up with them. And they said, Pete, you've got to go to Australia. It's an amazing place. You know, you'd love it. Go there and, you know, find out about it. And a couple of friends decided they were going to come to Australia for a year. And I said, I'll come. So there was three of us. Myself, another bartender, and his girlfriend. We all came to Australia for a year in 93. And there's me backpacking back in 93. Eventually arrived in Perth in late 92, I think it was 2 days before Christmas in 1992, arrived in Perth and spent 3 months there, did all kinds of lovely things like scuba diving and went up to the Pinnacles Desert and all sorts of other things. And after a couple of weeks, I decided to look up the Seventh-day Adventist Church, and I went to Mount Lawley Seventh-day Adventist Church in Western Australia, in Perth there. Now, I think the church isn't there now, but it was at that time. And so I went there and I listened and I made some great friends there. And then I went to Sydney. I came over to Sydney, just intending to spend 3 months there. And I went to the Chatswood Adventist Church. And I went into the church, and I think after, it was either the first week or the second week, they had an afternoon meeting. So I went there for Sabbath school, went there for church, had lunch, had an afternoon meeting. And the pastor there, he was there, and he was asking, Peter, tell us how you came to come into the church. And so I shared what I've shared with you so far. And he said, have you ever been baptised? I said, no. He said, would you like to be baptised? I said, well, yeah, I was thinking about it. Maybe one day. I thought maybe when I get back to England, I get baptised. And he said, would you like to study? And so I started studying with the pastor. You know, I found it's an important question to ask people. Have you ever been baptised? Would you like to be baptised? Sometimes if we never ask the question, people never are given an opportunity to make a response. I start studying with the pastor. I'm still drinking at this point. I remember going to a party next door to one of the backpacker houses I was staying in. I went to the party next door. A couple of girls had invited me there. I was talking to a guy across the table, and I was drunk. He was half drunk, and I was talking to him about the mark of the beast. It's not a great combination. And I remember getting up from that table and going into the bathroom and locking the door, and I was looking in the mirror, and I just looked at myself and I thought, do you have any idea of how idiotic you sound? I mean, what kind of a witness are you? And I guess that was the night that I decided I was going to quit drinking. Because I thought, originally I thought, well, I'm going to drink moderately. I was a big drinker and I thought I'll just drink moderately. Well, that never happens for me. If I go to a party, I never drink moderately. Who drinks one anyway? And besides which, even if I only drank one beer a month, people could still say, well, Peter drinks and he's a Christian. So we don't want to ever play with alcohol. We don't need it. And God knows that we're a better witness without it. So that night I recognised what a fool I'd made of myself and basically gave up drinking, which was funny because I was working at the Crow's Nest bottle shop in Sydney. And I was, selling alcohol. I remember one night this lady came in. She looked older. I don't know how old she was, but she probably looked older than she was. And she would buy a cask of red wine every night. And I knew who was drinking that. And she would come in the next night and buy a cask, and the next night and buy a cask. And you could see it all over her face, that it was destroying her life. And I said to myself, I can't do this. I can't keep feeding this woman's addiction and helping her to kill herself, basically. And so I started having second thoughts about that work. Well, finally the day came for me to be baptised, and I remember before that day, it was coming up to the baptismal day, and I was saying, Lord, I was praying and I was saying, Lord, if you want me to become a Christian, what an interesting question to ask the Lord. If you want me to become a Christian. I said, Lord, if you want me to become a Christian, find me some work in your vineyard. And I don't even know why I said that. I guess I figured that after I got baptised, I'd been 3 months in Sydney, I was going to go up to Brisbane and carry on the tour of Australia. But I know what would have happened if I'd have gone up to Brisbane. I wouldn't have known any people. I'd have gotten into restaurant work again because that was the easy work I knew. Probably have fallen back into my old habits. But I said, Lord, if you want me to become a Christian, find me some work in the vineyard. And the pastor said to me one time we were Bible studying, he said, I've been asking the Lord to find me a young volunteer to help me run some programs in the church. And I said, well, that's funny because I've been asking the Lord to find me some work in the church. And he said, well, maybe the Lord's putting us together. And at that point, I went to my knees and I said, Lord, is this really what you want me to do? Because I wanted to get out of it at that point. I thought, if I do this, I'm going to end up spending 9 months in Sydney. I won't get to tour Australia. That's why I came here for. It's my agenda. I'm a backpacker. I'm going to have to stay in Sydney for 9 months, be a volunteer. Is this really what you want me to do? And it was as if the Lord said to me, Peter, you asked me and I gave it to you. What do you want to do? And almost against my own interests, I said, yes, I'm going to do this. This is crazy, but I'm going to do it. And I got baptised, and a week later I began working as a volunteer for the Greater Sydney Conference. But it was about this time that I really gave my heart to the Lord. That decision to give in to the will of God as opposed to the will of me, that was the greatest decision I ever made. Getting baptised was a great decision, but this was a real crucial moment for me. Was I going to do what God wanted me to do, or was I just going to do my own thing? And it was really when I gave my heart to the Lord. I just want to read Ephesians chapter 3 and verses 14 to 21. It says this, for this reason I bow my knees to the Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, from whom the whole family in heaven and earth is named, that he would grant you, according to the riches of his glory, to be strengthened with might through the Spirit in the inner man, that Christ may dwell in your hearts through faith, that you, being rooted and grounded in love, may be able to comprehend with all the saints what is the width and length and depth and height, to know the love of Christ which passes knowledge, that you may be filled with all the fullness of God. Now to him who is able to do exceedingly abundantly above all that we ask or think, according to the power that works in us, to him be glory in the church by Christ Jesus, to all generations forever and ever. Amen. And it was at this time that I gave my heart to the Lord. When I started working with that Pastor Metcalf, he had one of these and it was wrapped in cellophane. And he gave it to me. He says, take this, I want you to read it and learn it and use it. And I looked at it and I said, wow, I got one of my own. Isn't this amazing? That this was printed in Australia. And here I am, about to undertake the work of the ministry in Australia. And I thought, wow, that's incredible how God does that. Well, I worked for a couple of months. I went to a friend's wedding in the States. And I came back from that wedding. I went to America just for a week to see my friend, another cocktail bartender. Most of my friends were bartenders at this time. Went to see him get married, came back to Australia, and I'd been away from England now for about 9 months. And I was kind of feeling a bit of homesick, and I was kind of feeling a little lonesome. And I remember going to my knees and praying on the 3rd of August 1993, and I said, Lord, can you find me a wife? I don't know if you've ever prayed that prayer before, but I prayed that prayer. I was saying, Lord, I've looked in the past and I've looked in all the wrong places and I always find the wrong kind of person. Lord, I want you to find me a wife. And I'm not saying that this is going to happen to everybody, but all I know is I met my wife 3 days later. 3 days later, there was a Sydney City Mission outreach program where you sleep out. It's called the Winter Sleep Out. You sleep out in the winter. There's 3,000 people there on the Opera House steps. And I knew a few people there and they introduced me to Marie. And Marie became my wife. She didn't become my wife that night. She didn't even want to know me for a month. So you've got to believe in miracles. But I met her 3 days after praying that prayer. God was amazing. We got married in 95. I briefly went home to England. I did a number of other things. I became a truck driver for a little while. And got married to Marie. After 6 months, we moved down to Warburton. I was working at the Warburton Hospital. Worked there for a couple of years. And I thought, hey, isn't this amazing? Here I am now living and working in Warburton, which is where this thing was printed. And then after a couple of years, we were expecting Daniel, our first and only child. And I thought, I'm working in the restaurant at the Warburton Hospital. I was working evenings and weekends. And I thought, when my son comes along, I want to be able to spend Sabbaths together. I want to be able to have a job that doesn't require weekends and evenings. And so I asked if I could get a job at the Science Publishing Company. And I started a mature age apprenticeship in the bindery there. The first day I was working at the Science, we were printing this. And a shiver ran down my spine, and I figured I'd come home. I was amazed that God could do that. That was me working in the restaurant, working at the Science Publishing Company. I worked there for 7 years, and then God tapped me on the shoulder and said, I've got something else I want you to do. There's a couple of things I want to share with you. First of all, I think about Steve, who shared his faith with me. And he didn't have a lot of faith, but he shared what he had. If we share what we know, it'll grow. If we keep what we've got, it'll rot. You see, the reason God calls us to share our faith is not simply for all those out there who can hear the gospel, but it actually grows our faith. The reason I got into evangelism and soul-winning work is because it grows my faith every time I'm involved. Praise God, it reaches others too, but it grows my faith. And Steve's faith was beginning to grow as he shared with me what he knew about God. So much so that Steve eventually became an elder in the church. His wife became a Seventh-day Adventist, the other waitress became a Seventh-day Adventist, and I became a Seventh-day Adventist. So share your faith, it will grow your faith. What was fascinating is when Steve rejoined the church, he lent a cassette to his mother, who burst into tears, got rebaptised, and his mother and father are both now in the church. From that mess of them leaving the church, God was able to bring around a miracle. It never fails to amaze me how God can take something bitter like lemon and make lemonade. God can bring something good out of a bad situation. So share your faith. It will grow your faith. Another thing is God can reach anyone, anywhere. I'm thoroughly convinced of that. There's no one that is out of God's reach. I had no interest in God, and yet God was able to reach me. And thirdly, God has a plan for your life, just as He has a plan for my life. The plan God has for your life may be different. There are some things that are God's general will for all of us. The Ten Commandments, for instance. But God may have a specific plan for your life that's different to the plan for my life. God needs mechanics and carpenters and teachers and business people and all manner of other kinds of professions. Maybe He's got a plan to use you where you are. So all I would say today is one of my favourite verses in the Bible. We haven't had it on the screen. It's John 8:32. It says, "You shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free." And that's been my experience, that knowing God has really made my life free. Finding God has been the greatest thing that ever happened to my life. I can't believe how great my life is because God's in it. And the reason we want to share the gospel in these programs that are coming up in the next few weekends is we want everybody else to know that there's freedom in Jesus Christ. And we want them to know that God has a plan for their life. The truth will make you free. And when you're free indeed. Amen.